Well, hello there, how are you all doing? Okay, as you can no doubt see, this is another preview chapter. This is early on in the story. Features a couple of new characters, well, three, one of which is a CIA agent, one of them is a New York police detective, and the other is a New York police officer. The New York police detective is called Gerald Mason. There's Officer Fenton, who's the police officer, and Massimo or Maz Pastoraro, who is the CIA agent. And they are currently investigating what they believe is a ritualistic murder of quite a high profile elite individual by the name of Nelson Byron, who is part of a very wealthy and controlling elite family that has been found in a CIA honeypot apartment that they use for blackmailing, well, setting up blackmail schemes on prominent politicians, but the elites use it to take their bits on the side. And obviously he's dead. Anyway, the title of this chapter is Some Things You Just Can't Unsee. So, oops. As the elevator doors slid open, the two men were once again greeted by an exact same hallway as the one they'd just left, except in this hallway, and dominating either of its sides were two lines of police officers of varying rank, gender, age, and varying degrees of discomfort. The sound throughout the hall was deafening, as the deep vibratory voices of all the male officers drowned out the fainter sounds of the significant female officers' voices. What are you doing, daft dog? Sorry, that's not part of it. From what he could tell, and as he suspected, there were officers from at least 3 different precincts here, which for such a high profile victim was perfectly normal. The city would pull out all the stops to close this case as fast as possible and put everything they had at their disposal on this case. He hated this kind of reaction by the bureaucrats at the top. They wouldn't do this for just anyone off the streets or the countless homeless that were found dead daily. Just because this guy was part of an elite family, he got special treatment. He ground his teeth angrily as he walked down the long hallway to the open door at its end. "Who's Nelson Byron?" Fenton said uncomfortably. He didn't really want to ask because he knew full well that he should know who he was, but the fact was he didn't keep up with the lives of the rich and famous, so he genuinely didn't have a clue what was so special about the guy. Mason glared at him in furious disbelief through the side of his eye for a moment, before raising an eyebrow in genuine surprise. At first he thought Fenton was making some sort of joke, but quickly realised that Fenton was being serious. He really didn't know who Nelson Byron was, and Mason appreciated the chance to show off a bit of his knowledge on the upper echelons of the societal hierarchy. "Nelson Byron," Mason began, with the authority of a university lecturer in his tone, "is, or rather was, the third in line to the Byron estate and one of the richest men in the world. His family were originally Finnish and date back at least 1,000 years. His bloodline, my boy, pure fucking bloodline. Someone's murdered him in our city. It ain't a good situation we're in, bud. Heads will roll if we don't find whoever did it, and that's all you need to know." Just as Fenton was about to ask a follow-up question, the two men reached the door to the penthouse at the end. The bright lights from inside the vast room beyond temporarily blinded them as they walked through, their shoes clunking on the solid and highly polished antique oak flooring. Immediately after their eyes adjusted from the dim light of the hallway, they were greeted by the sight of at least 100 detectives, all deep in conversation and discussion about what happened and their various theories. Mason ignored the majority of them, heading directly for the most experienced and preferably familiar detective he could see to find out where the crime scene was. As he neared a stockily built, short-cropped and grey-haired detective towards the back of the room, a familiar voice took his attention, coming from an open door on the left-hand side. "Mason!" The voice was gruff and commanding. "Through here!" As he entered this room, he couldn't help but be struck by not only how enormous this room was, but by the sheer opulence of the artwork on the walls, the sculptures against the walls, and on display stands and tables. It was like being in an art gallery, only this was a bedroom. As his head lifted towards the extremely high ceiling, his gaze was immediately taken by the almost full-length skylight above, where there should be a ceiling. He couldn't help but imagine how awesome the night sky must look on a night that was clear and not covered by storm clouds. Storm clouds. That thought suddenly brought him back to reality, as he allowed his eyes to travel towards an enormous hole directly above where the bed was. His eyes travelled down the back wall behind the bed and ignored the huge mirror dominating it towards the bed. On it were huge broken pieces in numerous sizes and shapes of 3-inch thick glass that came from the skylight above. Then he realised what he first assumed to be red satin sheets weren't red. A few tiny patches of white striking through the red confirmed what he hoped wasn't what he thought it was. Blood. Lots and lots of blood. His eyes continued down, following the blood from the end of the bed to the floor and continued to a few feet in front of it, where he saw the first chunk of what he knew was the upper torso of a woman. "These must be the tits Harry told me about," he thought to himself as he scanned the nearby area of the room for any other parts of the woman's body, but to no avail. His eyes continued to track the continued blood trail towards his position in the room and immediately stopped at its centre. Exactly in the centre was a huge circular symbol drawn out in blood and filled with various strange looking geometric shapes and patterns, surrounded and filled by what he at first thought to be some sort of weird symbology, but then realised that it looked like some sort of ancient language. On top of some of the shapes, neatly placed in their middle, was an individual organ from one of the victims, but he wasn't sure at this point which victim they were from. However, pride of place, and with the most intricate and detailed symbols in the middle of it all, was a human heart. Then something occurred to him. "Where's Barry?" he loudly asked. His voice cutting through the now noticeable cacophony of voices coming from the numerous detectives lining the outer edges of the room. "I don't see any sign of him. Where is he?" Out the corner of his eye, he noticed the hand of one of the detectives pointing up to the back wall behind him. And as he turned around to look up, what greeted him, he had to admit, even unsettled him. Tied around the wrists of a man and around an ornate-looking wooden beam about halfway up the extremely high wall, holding him up with his arms held straight up, were the man's intestines that were still attached to his body and coming out of a gaping hole where his lower portion of his body from the waist down should have been. Leaning his body slightly forwards and balancing him perfectly steady and rigid in his pose, splayed out from his back as if like wings, was the back of the man's ribcage. The man's head, pointing downwards, didn't hide the view of his face, or rather where his face would have been had the man had one. "So," Mason said, trying to act calm as he addressed the room, "a perfectly normal, run-of-the-mill murder then, and not at all ritualistic in any kind of way, I take it." He looked to his right-hand side to see Fenton surprisingly composed and furiously drawing an incredibly detailed sketch of their view of this horrifying spectacle. Fenton, tongue poking out the side of his mouth, turned towards Mason and flashed him an excited-looking smile before returning to his drawing. "Well, at least someone's getting some enjoyment out of this," he said with a chuckle, just as he was approached by the owner of the familiar voice he heard earlier. "Quite a sight, wouldn't you agree, Mason?" The gruff yet well-spoken voice came from a thin and hunched-over Mediterranean-looking man in his mid-40s. His face was covered in a few days' growth of stubble. It was only just noticeable from behind the turned-up collar of a full-length black trench coat. The man raised a styrofoam cup of hot coffee to his lips and lifted the plastic lid. Blew into the cup before taking a brief sip. "How you doing, Maz?" Mason's tone, unusually friendly and full of respect in Fenton's ears, as he turned to see who Mason was talking to. Didn't expect to see you here. It's been a while, buddy. How's the agency treating you? Maz cracked a wry smile. Oh, you know, Maz replied, extending Mason the same friendliness and respecting response. The agency is still the agency. We're thrown in when we're not wanted and take all the fun out of your job. Two of them shared a brief chuckle as Yeats continued to stare at the body on the wall. Fenton just stared at the two men, looking confused and not really getting whatever joke the two men shared. Being the inquisitive sort, he just had to know, but before he got the chance to ask, Maz spoke first. You know what, my friend, this case, well, I don't know what it is, but he paused for a brief moment, deep in thought, trying to choose his words carefully. There's something unusual about it that I can't quite put my finger on what that something is, you know? Mason nodded in agreement, and the two men turned around to face the room in unison and took a deep breath before again in unison let out a deep sigh. I know exactly what you mean, Mason replied. Something is definitely off, that's for sure. I just can't think what either. Fenton shook his head, not quite sure how to respond. As far as he could see, everything in the room was off. From the symbol drawn in blood on the floor, to the human organs neatly arranged within it, to the half a dead guy hanging on the wall, now behind them, with his ribcage pulled out of his back, to the broken skylight above it all, that was letting the rain through. A broken skylight that he was struggling to come up with a reasonable explanation of how the killer, or killers, got through that glass in the first place. None of what he seemed, to him at least, seemed the slightest bit normal. So what they found to be normal in this entire situation was beyond him. To do with this strange behaviour from the two men, he concluded that this was why they were detectives and he wasn't. He just couldn't get that notion to sit still, though. It wasn't adequate enough. Suddenly Mason broke him out of his train of thought. Got it, he said, after slowly and carefully scanning the room. So those two guys stood in the corner against the far wall. Even Fez don't wear suits that expensive, or agency guys like you either, for that matter. It's them, that's the odd ones out here. Maz smiled and leaned his head forward to take a brief glance at a very confused looking Fenton, desperately looking for the men in the sea of suits and detectives that Mason was seeing. A little more to your left, son, behind that female officer with the short skirt and nice legs walking past them now. Fenton zeroed in on the first skirt and the ocean of pants that he saw and let out a knowing, aha. Mason smirked and realised his bad manners. Officer Bill Fenton, allow me to introduce you to CIA agent Massimo Pastoraro, an old high school and army buddy of mine. Fenton nodded towards Maz, and Maz returned with his own nod back before speaking outside of his mouth, never taking his gaze away from the two unusual men. I wasn't talking about them, Maz said quietly. Well, Stu, I've no idea who they are, or even what agency they're from, but my orders were to escort them here so they could observe the investigation. My section chief said I should keep an eye on them too. They really spooked him, and as a result, spooked me. That's not what I'm talking about. Mason turned his head slightly towards Maz before cutting him off. Really? Mason's interest was piqued. If the CIA has been told to withhold information on who they are or what agency they're from, then who are they? Private contractors? Mason paused for a moment in deep thought before Fenton asked the same thing he was about to ask himself. Well, where the hell are this guy's protection detail? He said with a puzzled tone, his head feverishly looking around in every direction. Surely this place should be covered in bodyguards or some sort of security force at least. So where are they? Mason nodded with approval. He was actually impressed with the young man. That's a damn good point, kid, he said with a slight increase in respect. Where are they all indeed? Mason still couldn't keep his eyes away from the two overly well-dressed men across the room. They were virtually identical. If he didn't know any better, he'd swear they were twins. For Christ's sake, they even have the exact same haircut too, he thought to himself, as Maz began to answer the lack of security detail isn't that unusual, really. Maz began again, outside of his mouth. We build this kind of thing at the agency all the time for, honeypots. We say they're 100% secure, only one way in, and only they can get in or out, and whoever they like. Or let out. I always suspected that they may have been used by the wealthy to meet their knockoffs in complete privacy. Looks like we may have oversold the 100% secure claim though, eh? Maz noted with amusement, as did Mason and Fenton at the same time, and Maz continued. The only thing I can't work out is, how has no one found the hidden camera behind the mirror yet? Or the recording room? The other two men immediately snapped their heads towards him, mouths open. Maz sniggered. Perhaps, he said a little nervously, perhaps I should have mentioned that earlier. Mason gestured with his head for Maz to lead the way. The two of them left the business of the bedroom out into the main hallway and behind a staircase in the middle of the hall that led to the roof. They all waited behind the stairs for a few moments. Maz with his back to the wall, and when the noise levels became sufficiently loud enough again, Maz lifted his foot and gave the wall a light tap, revealing the door to a tight spiral staircase heading downward behind him, and the three men hurried their way through and down the staircase, closing the door behind them. At the bottom of the staircase lay a small room full of computer equipment and a near wall-sized screen at one end of the room, displaying the viewpoint of several cameras dotted around the penthouse. Maz took a chair in front of the screens and brought up the camera feed from the bedroom of your earlier, showing Nelson Byron asleep in bed with a far younger looking woman there with her back towards the camera. Nothing much happened the first time until Nelson began to get restless. He was having a nightmare. Right, there you go. That's another chapter. Like I said, I'll probably do another one soon when I can pick one that I know isn't going to spoil too much of. Well, isn't going to spoil the first book. And isn't going to spoil too much of this book. Hopefully, you enjoyed that. And might actually, if you haven't read the first book, you maybe might think about reading it. Anyway, I'll leave a link down below for where you can buy it from my publisher. I think it's 20% off at my publishers than you would normally pay on Amazon or Waterstones or anything like that. So I think you get about £3-4 quid off, something like that, I think. So instead of $13.99, I think it's something like a tenner. But yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.